Again, it's very interesting to see the list of national days that are available for us to celebrate. And today is the International Day for Food Loss and Food Waste. Now, I remember when I was a young man first seeing the images of malnourished people that were transmitted from Africa, from Ethiopia in particular, and being deeply moved by that as a young boy. I remember looking at my plate of food and looking at these children who had clearly been hungry for a very long time, and still to this day it confounds me that we haven't found the solutions that enable us to be able to move food to those people who desperately need it. Of course, this comes down to politics, this comes down to international borders, it comes down to banking, and a lack of will as well as a lack of money. And to me, in my own house, I still struggle with this. I often find myself overeating because I just cannot bear to throw away food, which is ridiculous because if it has to be thrown away into my body or into the bin, then I'd probably be doing my body a service to throw it into the bin. And yet I really struggle with that. I guess I grew up in a family where we didn't have so much in the way of spare food. You know, we ate everything that we had on our plates because we were hungry or because we were maybe greedy. But in any rate, there wasn't a great deal of food waste in my house, and so I really struggle in these times where such inordinate amounts of food seems to be wasted. As a young man, I remember really getting into bin scavenging out the back of supermarkets for a period of time. This had become a bit of a thing, and it was amazing to me that I could turn up at a supermarket and find all this food that was still in date, that was being thrown out because they were making way for new food to come in. And we fed ourselves and other people through that process for some time until eventually the supermarkets began to destroy all of the food that was being thrown out, purportedly because of health and safety concerns, because they didn't want anyone to get ill having this food that wasn't out of date, that was in a bin. Really, I think it was about protecting their custom, and maybe there were legal cases that they were trying to save themselves from. But in any rate, I mean, nowadays that food from the supermarkets, which is to be wasted, can sometimes go to food banks and food recycling projects, but there's still a certain amount of, and I think probably quite a significant amount of waste that goes on. Far more goes on in the course of all of our households, where people are now generally buying their food via supermarkets, often online, regular orders coming in, and the food is just not consumed quickly enough, and therefore huge amounts of food goes into our bins. It's an absolute crying shame, and yet it's very difficult to know how to do it differently. My family, we really try to get as much local and organic produce as we possibly can, and it is difficult, it is challenging. We actually this year tried to become self-sufficient with our garden and had an enormous slap in the face, realizing just how complex that is, just how much food would need to be created, and not just a massive bounty appearing for a couple of months in the summer. Enough food that could be preserved and stored to sustain oneself through a year. It's a very challenging proposition. And it's made very difficult these days by the amount of time that we have at our disposal, where everything seems to be constantly more demanding, more pressures on our time. And so to find the time to be able to garden and harvest and wash and clean and store and preserve, it's a full-time job in itself. And so we are part of a system which is continuing to create not just enormous amounts of food, but enormous amounts of food waste. Now, in our family, we really try to put all food waste of any kind into our compost. Obviously not cooked stuff, because that's not good for your compost, it attracts rats. But we try to really make sure that we reuse everything that goes to waste. And even then, we struggle to create enough compost for what we need in the garden. We also struggle to, well, and then sometimes we can also end up with too much. It's a confusing thing. So, internationally, how do we celebrate food loss and food waste? I mean, that's not something to celebrate, is it really? Maybe it's an opportunity for us to celebrate bringing this stuff to consciousness, bringing this stuff to mind. And just as we are really managing to create enormous gluts of surplus food, we're still struggling to distribute it. And so undoubtedly that accentuates the level of pain and guilt that we in the West can experience every time we throw something in the bin. And I don't want to make that worse for us, because as individual consumers, it's very difficult to know how to do it differently. When we are struggling so much just to survive, just to pay the electricity bills, just to keep the banks and the bailiffs and everybody at bay, well, sacrifices and compromises have to be made. And to live some idealistic utopian existence of never being a hypocrite, of never contributing to the degradation of the natural world as we see it, I would say is tantamount to being impossible. Unless we turn our backs on civilization altogether and turn to fields like this to build our shelters, which we wouldn't be allowed to do, it's going to be very difficult to be able to really bring ourselves in alignment with the aspiration to not be creating food waste. Waste itself is a bit of a strange concept, because nature wastes. It creates a bounty of apples on a tree, and only so many can be eaten, even in the best of circumstances. Many fall to the ground and are consumed by worms. They become fertilizer. Food waste has always existed, but yet I suppose in the past it had a more direct way back into the environment. And the trouble is now is that so much of our food waste ends up in those black plastic bags, only to be buried in landfill. I think they're black because they're there to conceal from us the truth of what it is that we're throwing back into the earth, and ironically makes the situation even worse. They might be black, but they're still wrapped in plastic, and they're not being recycled at any time soon. Obviously, in the context of Earth's great unfolding, of the enormous amounts of time that we have seen on this planet, then they will eventually find their way back to nature. But whether or not the Earth can forgive us for that or not is another question. So today, these are my thoughts. Not so much celebrating, but remembering the fact that we are creating a huge amount of waste. If we were to really think of the next 7 generations, we would probably stop immediately. But I'm not convinced that the immediate cessation of civilization is what's called for. But what's called for certainly is a new paradigm in how we approach living in harmony with nature. Just taking a moment of silence to remember what it is to live in harmony with nature.